Major General Thomae, in his 2023 CoveTalk, stated of the 2nd Australian Division that we are of and from the community. As part of the Australian Army, our people are our key strength. We are prepared and adapted to serve the nation in whatever way the government and the people ask of us. It's also important to remember that in 1915, the 2nd Division was raised as a combat division of the 1st AIF. On that point, it is our warfighting skills, knowledge and attributes that allow us to adapt to any task off the line of march. Whilst our history is vitally important, we are not tethered by it. The world is less stable, less certain, and with several long-running conflicts, the future is unclear. The question is, where are we going next? And to misquote an often heard quip, what now, Division Commander? Welcome to the 2nd Australian Division's last Tuesday of the month PME. I'm your host, Major Jeremy Barraclough. This month we have the privilege to speak with the Commander of both the 2nd Division and Joint Task Force 629, Major General David Thomae, AM. We will hear of his reflection on both commands as he glimpses into what the future may hold for the JTF, the 2nd Division and the wider Australian Army. Some quick notes as usual before we start. This is part of the CoveTalk series recorded on the 26th of November 2024. All information presented here is deliberately at the unclassified level, and views presented here are those of the individual presenting them and not the official positions of the Australian Army, Department of Defence or the Australian Government. Lastly, thanks to the program partners being the Cove, Australian Army Research Centre, Randwick Barracks Officers Mess and the Gallipoli Barracks Officers Mess here at Enoggera hosting us today. Please connect with your friends and share this PME because it's how learning happens. Now, with that out of the way, please put your hands together for our Commander, Major General Thomae, AM.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, mate. Well, good afternoon. I'd like to first commence by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet today, the Turrbal and Yuggera people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge those First Nations people who have or are serving in the Australian Defence Force. It's a real privilege to be here to talk to you today. My last time as Commander of the 2nd Australian Division and Commander of Joint Task Force 629. I'll hand over to Major General Burr next Saturday, so that's the 7th of December. In my tenure, 3.5 years, the division has really changed, and I want to talk a little bit about what I will describe as a pre-DSR world and a post-DSR world and how that impacts on the division. And I'll give some context for that as we go through, but I'd like to start where I began my journey in this division as Brigade Commander in 2019. In that world, we were all about reinforcing battle groups, reinforcing combat brigades. The combat brigade was the unit of action of the Australian Army, and we spent an enormous amount of effort at formation level generating a reinforcing battle group to provide to a combat brigade in a 2-year cycle as part of Beersheba Force Generation. At the end of 2019, there started to be some bushfires in southeast Queensland that quickly spread down the east coast all the way through to South Australia. And very quickly, there was a requirement for reservists to be stood up to support the Australian community. At its peak, when we called out 3,000 reservists from Victoria, the first time we'd used the Section 28 Defence Act call-out powers for the division, many members of the division were then pushed into that operation. There was an overlap between the ending of bushfires and the commencement of COVID-19. And that's when Joint Task Force 629 was officially stood up by the Chief of Defence Force. And Joint Task Force 629 remains as one of the standing joint task forces, one of two, that and Maritime Border Command 639, to provide the operational C2 construct for all domestic support operations from DAC all the way through to Homeland Defence. And I'll talk a little bit about that journey as well. But pre-DSR, the division still was trying to identify what its role was, and as Army abandoned the Beersheba model because it was unsustainable, we had to decide what we're going to do for the future. And then the Defence Strategic Review came out. And to say that it has made an impact on Army is a massive understatement. For all of us in the Army, the Defence Strategic Review has provided the clearest guidance, strategic guidance on what the role of the Army is into the future. And it was different from what it was pre-DSR. And that role, as described in the Defence Strategic Review, has been carried through to the National Defence Strategy. And I want to take you through the National Defence Strategy because, what really important that comes out of the National Defence Strategy is the difference between national defence and defence of Australia. And for the government of the day, they have described the Defence Strategic Review as being the most consequential review of defence since the DIB review in the 1980s. But the Defence of Australia doctrine that came out of the DIB review in the 1980s was in an environment where there was 10 years warning, there was no identified threat, and for Army, there was no defined role other than Defence of Australia and then our contributions to offshore expeditionary operations as part of a coalition partnership. It was a long period of, and for the 2nd Division, really no real clarity on its role going forward, and really became a repository of reinforcements for the full-time Army to support the ongoing operations, whether they were into Timor, the Solomons, the Middle East area of operations. The division was really all about raise, train and sustain on behalf of the force employers, whoever they might be. But what the National Defence Strategy has done is given us really clear purpose, and along with the Integrated Investment Program, tells us where the resources will be into the future for the Army. And at its most central part of that, we're starting to see that come alive. M1A2 tanks soldiers have been trained on those. So the last elements of the combat arms fighting system are falling into place. That transformation of 3 Brigade into a heavy amphibious brigade is moving at pace and will continue to move at pace into 2025. The raising of the 10th Brigade as a fires brigade, long-range fires and air defence, is critical to the success of Army in the National Defence Strategy. The reorganisation of the 1st Division as a division that has its combat brigades, now will have its logistics brigade and the fires brigade, elevates the division as the unit of action of the Army. For the 2nd Division, we get 9 Brigade back, so we'll have our 5 brigades plus the Regional Force Surveillance Group plus our direct command units. So the division becomes the unit of action for the Australian Army. So that change between what Defence of Australia was and where we are now really relates to our strategic circumstances. They have never been more fraught. We don't have a 10-year warning window. In fact, the way the National Defence Strategy is organised is around 3 epochs, and I'll take you through those 3 epochs and what they mean for the division. That extended strategic competition between China and the United States is playing out as we see it in our primary area of military interest. And other conflicts, whether they're in the Middle East or Ukraine, are demonstrating the tensions on the global rules-based order. So what does the National Defence Strategy say about what Defence and Army is required to do? Its number 1 priority is, not surprisingly, defend Australia and its immediate region. Its second is to deter through denial any attempt to project force against Australia through its northern approaches. Third, protect Australia's economic connection to the region and the world. Fourth, contribute with our partners for collective security in our area. And fifth, contribute to the rules-based global order. But if you put it at its key point, it is defend Australia and its immediate region. And for the 2nd Division, that is a clear role that we've been given by government to defend Australia as part of an integrated force. And we've been testing that as we go through. Importantly, the National Defence Strategy elevates the strategic intent to include whole of government and whole of nation, and builds into it additional lines of effort through national resilience, which talks about critical infrastructure in our northern base network to make sure Australia is resilient enough to enter crisis and conflict. And the 2nd Division plays a key role in that as well. The Chief of Army has released the land domain concept, which nests within the National Defence Strategy, and that provides the characteristics of the land domain in an integrated force. And those characteristics are described as persistence, asymmetry, presence, versatility, and value. And for the 2nd Division, all of those are what we have to live by to achieve the Chief of Army's requirements and meet the requirements of the National Defence Strategy. Persistence is about our continued engagement in a whole of government, whole of nation approach, whether it's at local, state or federal government, through our formations across Australia. It's our capacity to operate across Northern Australia through the Regional Force Surveillance Group and our exercises, joint collective training, such as what exercise Austral Shield we did this year. We are persistently in our region doing what we need to do. Asymmetry. We'll never have the scale of forces that we would like to meet the challenges that we face. So we will require to be asymmetric in our approach and innovative in how we use technology to magnify the capacity of our forces. And on exercise Austral Shield this year, I was really pleased to see that innovation from a ground up level from soldiers as we develop capability. Presence, that's the great thing about the 2nd Australian Division. We are in 138 locations around the country. We have a presence in all of our communities in the country and provide that connection for Army into community. That is the strength of the division and is something that we must maintain going forward. Versatility. Again, a great strength of the division. The skill sets of our people, the variety of tasks that we undertake, the capacity to reorient depending on the circumstances is something that we've really seen over the last 3 to 4 years and will continue to be very important into the future. And value. Army is very good value for money, and the 2nd Division is extremely good value even in that context of value. We operate at a fraction of the cost of the full-time Army to generate the effects that we must generate. So the National Defence Strategy tells us the strategic environment. The land domain concept then tells us what Army is to do through those lenses and characteristics. What we then do is, well, how do we apply the National Defence Strategy and the land domain concept to the tasks that are given to the 2nd Australian Division? And this is the concept for employment for the land forces in security in response. That concept of employment will go to the Chief of Army's Advisory Committee on Thursday for endorsement. And then we will publish that in short order after that. That tells the Australian community how the 2nd Division, as Joint Task Force 629, will achieve the objectives of the National Defence Strategy. And it's built on all the experience we've had from that 2019-2020 fires, through COVID, through floods in 2022, through lots more floods in 2022, aged care, and every other thing that we've been doing as a division since then, based on our soldiers, our operational C2 through our formations in each state and territory, the connections we have into state and local government that we exercise every year and rehearse, whether it's through joint collective training or actually responding to a high-risk weather season event. At its base, it relies on an operational C2 construct with the Joint Task Force 629 as a force employer. Headquarters 2DIV is a force generator. It's tasked through its formations to generate specified contingency forces to meet the tasking for Joint Task Force 629. But at the end of the day, Joint Task Force 629 will be allocated the forces it needs to achieve the mission as that is directed by government. But what the division will be doing is generating sufficient contingency forces to meet the requirement as defined at the moment in the theatre campaign plan. We do that through our formations. We have designed, in a force structure sense, the security and response task units, which we exercise for the first time on Exercise Austral Shield this year. One task unit securing a base, an Air Force base in northwestern Australia, the other operating across critical infrastructure and a patrol boat base in far north Queensland. We learnt many lessons from that, which we will then feed back into the design and employment as we go forward. So that design and concept for employment is now nested within the land domain concept and the National Defence Strategy. It is the clearest guidance now from strategic to tactical that I have seen in my 40 years in the Australian Army. Let's talk about epochs. So this is the one that takes us in the National Defence Strategy from when it was published earlier this year through to the end of 2025. This is the reorganisation phase of Army, and that is happening at pace. Only today, formations were moving from Forces Command to the 1st Division. And then early in January, the 9th Brigade returns to the 2nd Division. All of those changes are about organising the Army so that it can fight tonight. It has the habitual relations between its formations and the unit of action, the division, the 1st and 2nd Divisions. Forces Command is then focused exclusively on training, both at an individual and a collective training level through the Combat Training Centre. That is an important change for our Army. The other commands, Special Operations Command, Aviation Command, have their specific roles that they perform as we move forward. But in Epoch 1, that reorganisation for the division is also linked to matching that purpose with the resources needed for the division to fulfil its role. The Army rebalance of equipment has seen hundreds of extra vehicles and equipment move into the division. We are generating capabilities that the division has never generated since World War II. And a simple example is the generation of snipers within the division. We have now qualified 3 snipers from scratch. They're not ex-full-time, they are soldiers who decided that they wanted to be on the journey to become a sniper and have gone off and done their sniper courses with the Royal Australian Regiment and have finished and completed and been fully qualified. That's an example where the will to achieve is met by the enthusiasm of our soldiers to deliver that capability. Now that will go across all the capabilities that we're asked to generate into the future. So in that window from now until 2025 is the opportunity to experiment, rehearse, look at force structure, look at conditions of service, look at how we organise as a division so that we can improve our preparedness and readiness. The second epoch is where the equipment, the reorganisation of the Army is complete, but all of the modernisation starts coming through the Army, whether it's littoral ships, long-range fires, the completion of the combat arms fighting system. All of that equipment is due to be delivered in Epoch 2. Now, a threat may arise that doesn't meet our timeline. As an Army, we will adapt to that requirement and meet the threat as we're faced. But what we will see in Epoch 2 is increasingly the design of the security and response task units and the division meeting the requirements of the threat of the day. And that is where we will go from where we are now to the force design that achieves all of its objectives. In that, there are opportunities to re-roll and apply force structure to meet emerging threats and requirements for capabilities. And a simple example of that is counter UAS. That is a requirement that requires both an individual training requirement, but also equipment and people dedicated to the role in a structural sense that can provide the brains, the detection and the effectors to achieve that. And there is a project within Army to do that, and we are looking at providing force structure from the division to achieve that role in that window from 2026 to 2030. For Epoch 3, 2031 and beyond, well past my use by date, but that will see much more of that technology that can provide an asymmetric advantage. And we're starting to see that in the experimentation being done through the 1st Armoured Regiment, where we are having autonomous vehicles, we're having the ability to operate at distance with lower risk, using platforms such as M113 to provide remotely crewed vehicles to achieve logistic effects and combat effects. So this is our opportunity in that period to bring innovation to effects through the 1st Armoured Regiment as the experimental testing unit for the Australian Army. What will underpin that progress to Epoch 3 is the big projects across defence to better enable decision making across the organisation. So the ability to digitise the Army and the Defence Force so that it gets decision advantage as we move forward. I'd just like to finish off by talking a little bit about people and the opportunity and risk that arises for the division and for part-time soldiering more generally. So the division is about 10,000 people, 1,000 full-time, 9,000 part-time. And over the years, through white papers and strategic reviews, the part-time workforce of the Australian Defence Force has been variously looked through the lens of, is it a strategic reserve or is it an operational reserve, or is it a bit of both? But depending on your lens can have a massive impact on the way that you train, sustain and resource that workforce. So in the current environment, the 2nd Australian Division, in fact, the part-time elements of the Australian Army are not a strategic reserve. They are an operational reserve. It requires the full commitment of the division to achieve its contingency force requirements. And therefore, that workforce, we need to better understand its capacity to meet that demand, and that's why we've introduced into PM Keys the capacity for us to understand our workforce much better. All soldiers in the Army, all reservists in the Australian Defence Force have been directed by CPERS to commence identifying what their employment category is, so that we can better understand what, if the demand signal is out there for call out, who might be excluded as an essential worker, as we experienced through bushfires and COVID. The second element that we are introducing is CERCAP 4. That's a service category where we can provide financial incentives for people to perform to a certain standard and achieve certain training outcomes. And the idea of that is to build up preparedness and readiness across the division through Epoch 1 into Epoch 2, because the requirement for part-time forces has never been more important to meet contingency requirements for the Australian Defence Force. The Army is simply not big enough to achieve all the things that it must achieve without the part-time workforce assisting in delivering that capability. One of the last things I'd just like to touch on is the opportunity for the total workforce system to be applied across epochs 1, 2 and 3 in generating new capabilities for the Australian Defence Force. Many Western armies operate equipment such as long-range fires using a part-time workforce, particularly in the United States and the United Kingdom. There is no reason we can't adopt that methodology here in Australia over Epoch 2. And therefore we should be looking at how do we expand our workforce, our part-time workforce, to achieve more capability for the Australian Defence Force. For me, as I sit in the inaugural mess where I was a formation commander and then that transition to division, as the division changed over the last 3 years, it's been a real privilege to be on that journey. And the headquarters that I've had the privilege to lead has changed itself over that time. It's become an operationally focused headquarters that has participated in all the joint collective training activities with Joint Operations Command. It is a standing joint task force that is deeply trusted by the Australian Defence Force and Joint Operations Command. It is an always-on organisation delivering through its formations and its soldiers across the entire country. And all I see for the future of the division and the Army is opportunity. And I hope to watch from the sides in the future as the division continues to evolve as it meets the challenges set for it by the National Defence Strategy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for talking to us today, sir. And if I'll just give people in the room a moment to prepare, I'll pose a question of my own. Is you've just finished talking about there's much to be proud of for your time tenure in commanding the division and 629. As you said, understanding our people with tracking civilian employment, seeing more and more vehicles and equipment coming through to the division, more focus, more skills, more opportunities for our people, and also reintroducing the SIRCAT 4 so we have that movement from a RTS capacity through to beyond a strategic to an operational and contingent force, really giving the division a good purpose. If I could ask you to cast your mind in the future, what do you think our next commander should be looking to be proud of? What aspirational goals should they be setting for the division, sir?
Hey, look, it's a good question, and I don't want to steal General Burr's thunder, but he will roll into a joint collective training program in 2025, which sees the divisional headquarters being responsible for Joint Task Force 629, deeply integrated inside the operational C2 construct for the Australian Defence Force. He will have joint collective training activities like exercise Talisman Sabre, which will be all about achieving those objectives out of the National Defence Strategy. The divisions will both be in the field for exercise Talisman Sabre. It is a huge undertaking for Army to achieve that outcome, and a really exciting time to continue to build on the capabilities that we have started this year with the Security and Response Task Units. I talk about the role of Division Commander as three things: provide role clarity, provide the resources to achieve that role clarity, and the opportunity to practice that role clarity. And until this year, I didn't feel like we had achieved that, but we have, with the Army Rebalance, the Joint Collective Training Program, we have started that journey, and next year is an exciting year to build on that.
Thanks, sir. We've got a question from the youngest person in the room.
G'day, mate.
Hi, sir. I'm Corey. Currently here on work experience, and I'm looking to join ADFA.
Great.
I was just wondering, what can I expect in joining the Army and in the future?
Hey, it's a really exciting time to join our Army. We are going through the biggest recapitalisation of our Army ever in the history of our Army, with some of the most sophisticated equipment coming into service over the next 10 years. But at its heart, despite all that recapitalisation, is the opportunity to lead Australian soldiers. So whether you're excited by tanks or Apache helicopters or missiles, what I hope you look to is the opportunity to work with Australian soldiers and lead them, because that is what gives you the best experience in our Army. So good luck, and I hope that you get into ADFA.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Corey. And again, for those in the room, raise your hand if you've got a question, while we get through some of them that come through online here. So, one for you from Captain Nicholas at the headquarters. He says, why is it beneficial to discriminate between the two roles of JTF 629 and the entity that is 2nd Division? Many people in the ADF, and indeed outside the ADF, conflate the two as a single entity, and some even express the opinion that it's challenging to explain, and is it actually useful to try and discriminate the two? What are your thoughts, sir?
Hey, it's a good question, but if I go back to March 2020, where 2nd Division didn't really have a role, and it was given the responsibility to raise Joint Task Force 629, and then that role as a JDF has been set in stone through the operational C2 construct from the Chiefs of Staff's Committee. It has given the clarity of purpose, but more importantly, the hook on resources for the division to organise itself to achieve its end. And I accept that that can be quite difficult at the headquarters level because our staffing levels don't match the ambition created by being a joint task force. But the model we have is, and this is the model for all of our operational C2 construct, is that in a crisis, we will be calling across the Defence Force to reinforce headquarters to achieve their operational outcomes. And we've done that through the last couple of years when we've required to. So at the height of the 2022 floods, we scaled the headquarters very quickly to be able to command and control over 7,500 ADF members as part of that activity. And that would be the similar model that we would adopt in a crisis or conflict. The value of describing it as a joint task force is that that works better inside a non-military environment, such as the strategic centre or into a whole of government, where they don't necessarily understand what divisions are. So I think I understand that tension that's created by having Headquarters 2nd Division and Joint Task Force 629, but I've been impressed with the way the staff who are dual-hatted are able to fuse that through the commander as the fusion of command as a division and fusion of command as a joint task force. That has been the important change that we made during COVID.
Thanks, sir. Okay, Captain Nick, I hope that answered your question. I've got another one from Major Christopher, again at the headquarters. His question poses around the traditional ARES recruiting paradigm and i.e. those not in full-time work or those underemployed to be able to fill their ARES obligations. And arguably, like every other employer, we're not quite getting the full fill that we need. It's been said outside that, Army overall is still not filled. So given that tension that we're challenging everybody to meet our recruiting targets, how is JTF 629 being able to meet that fill? And is there anything that 2nd Australian Division needs to be able to do or needs to be able to access to be able to meet the RTS or the fill demand for JTF 629 to meet those demands as directed by government?
Well, look, recruiting is a challenge for all of Army and for the whole Defence Force at the moment. What we are trying to do though is make the people's journey through their training system from recruit to trained soldier more adaptable to their circumstances. So if we want to increase the volume of people coming through and getting at the other end, then we have to change the way we've done training. And we've done that for the last 12 months where the recruit course went down to 3 weeks and then IET training spread and amortised over time, taking some risk in how we do that. And we've seen some promising results from that. But it's in the midst of very low unemployment in our society, and we are competing with many for that same workforce. What we've seen in the division though is a very large uptick in productivity. And what that means is our existing workforce, the average number of days that they are doing is increasing by about 20%. And that means we're pulling more out of our existing workforce to achieve what we need to do. Now, to make that sustainable, we need to continue bringing people in through the system. And incentives like CIRCAT 4, where people will get a bonus for doing specific things. The idea of that is one, to create preparedness and better readiness, but also to encourage people to come through the system and get to the training level required to get that extra resources given to them. But there's no easy answer. I don't have an easy answer. And how that matches into 629, remember 629 is merely a force employer. It will get a list of tasks and the Defence Force will have to provide the resources to achieve those tasks. Now, in a design sense, we're trying to do that in the first instance from the 2nd Australian Division, but that if that's insufficient to meet government's requirements, then those resources will come from elsewhere. And a really easy example of that is one of the critical parts of the National Defence Strategy is about integrated air missile defence. Defence of Australia requires on a very coherent plan for integrated air missile defence. The only ground-based air defence systems are in the Australian Army. They're in the 10th Brigade. And they are a rare resource that will need to be prioritised to meet theatre requirements. It's fair to say that that requirement in early days is likely to be defence of the homeland, particularly around our air bases.
Thanks, sir. We've got another question, and one of the benefits of having a division whose geographic spans across the continent is from the Pilbara Regiment.
Ah, great.
So Sergeant Blair, his question is, the Army's planning to generate organic UAS capabilities. His question pertains to at the subunit level across 2DIV or even below the subunit. So his intention is that we should be making modern and accessible, capable UASs available for those tactical tasks that they will have to do a platoon. And clearly there's a need at the RFSG so that they can expand their footprint, expand their surveillance area, enable early warning and all sorts of other surveillance operations required by all soldiers, not just the RFSG and not just the combat corps. Can you speak on where you think we're going or any strides that have already been made?
It's a really good question, and it comes hard against a regulatory framework that is designed for peace. And so therefore, for us to operate UAS outside of defence areas, we have to operate within the civilian air regulations. So that creates a lot of tensions in how we do it. But at its base, he's absolutely right. UAS will need to be across the entire organisation and be operated at every level within the organisation. I watched 9 Regiment last week fly UAS as part of a combined exercise with the Indian Army in India, and I was deeply impressed with the new capabilities. So this is the new quadcopter. It's a commercial off-the-shelf, but it's a high-end commercial off-the-shelf quadcopter that 9 Regiment is rolling out as part of an Army program. It was really impressive in terms of its capability from the one that they had before. So that advance as we go, we'll see that we will just need to get equipment in, put it in the hands of soldiers and train with it. But I see in a crisis a lot of that regulatory framework that provides restrictions on how we use UAS will move to the side, particularly in Northern Australia, and we'll have better opportunity. But I see we're on the cusp of that, and that's a good thing.
Thanks, sir.
You got a question?
Hope that answers your question, Sergeant Blair. Sam, just bring the microphone down.
So you mentioned that we've had an uptake in a lot of equipment within Epoch 1. Was there any equipment that you would have liked to have seen that we weren't able to get in Epoch 1, and do you see it coming in Epoch 2? And if so, how should we prepare for it?
It's a really good question, Wendy. I think you've got to be careful that you're not the dog that caught the car, and we might even be that right now. And I, as a CEO of a CISB, I understand the tension that creates. But as part of that Army rebalance, it was very much a design feature to make sure the holdings of equipment were linked to the joint logistic units around the country. And an intention through Army headquarters to reinforce the capability of those joint logistics units to better be able to maintain the equipment as we push it out. Now, in southeast Queensland, that's a bit easier, but when you're in Tasmania, whether you're in Western Australia, that is a more challenging proposition. So we will need to work through that process. I think, and I'm very grateful for the Chief of Army to have given the amount of equipment that we have gotten, and I still see that rebalance occurring where now that we're past major platforms, we're down into weapons, helmets, body armour, all those things. The kit necessary to have our specialist capabilities in the infantry battalions, the additional vehicles for logistics is really starting to make an impact at the tactical level in the division. But for all of Army, it's not just the 2nd Division, the maintenance of our equipment is a real challenge. And some of our fleets are more challenging than others, and you know that. What we need to do is build into the design of exercises the capacity to have a fleet and start looking after equipment in a fleet management sense. Units can't expect to have all of their vehicles on their parade ground every Tuesday, every weekend. Some of that fleet needs to be held in JLUs going through a cycle of maintenance, which we've never been able to do before because we just didn't have enough equipment. So that's the big change for the division, is having enough equipment that you can approach it from a fleet management perspective. And I hope that works out over the coming years. But as an Army, we need to invest a lot more in logistics. We did the logistics at the end, and I think that's starting to show in the tension as we realise we don't have enough. The whole Defence Force has that same problem. Thanks, Wendy.
Okay. I think that takes us to time, sir. So with that, I'd just like to offer thanks for coming on, taking time out of your day to come along and participate in this and provide us a presentation, a bit of insight to your thoughts. And for those of you out there, thank you for joining in online and in the room here. Thanks to the Cove for facilitating this and passing it through so we can stream it out to a wider audience. And again, thank you to the Randwick and Enoggera Barracks Officers Messes to facilitate and make these PME sessions happen, because this is how we learn and this is how we develop ourselves preparing for our warfighting roles. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and thank Major General Thomae, AM. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Jeremy.